So next we're delighted to introduce our slightly longer film called In a Contrary Place. This short film explores the impact of British colonisation and American culture on Irish national identities, in which people fleeing domestic hardship at home, created often by British policies, settled across the Atlantic, many eventually becoming part of ruling classes themselves. The form of the piece alludes to the pop culture fantasy of America as a kind of promised land, and so the film references three kinds of visionary forms. The first is the classic film and TV dream sequence. The second is the traditional Irish Imran, which is a hero's journey tale. And the third is the Ashling, which is a vision poem. We should say also that the film, when we show it without ourselves performing with it, it usually has a voiceover track and subtitles that follow the Irish mythological voyage of Moyle Doon, which is a story not unlike Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels or Homer's The Iliad.
And so we're going to do a kind of director's style commentary along with the film, which is a true story about ourselves. The video was shot all along the west coast of Ireland, from along this disused train line called the Western Rail Corridor, which runs from Sligo in the northwest to Limerick in the midwest. And the line kind of divides opinion between those who would like to see it reopen for train services and those who believe that it's not economically viable to do so. And we see this debate as a kind of a, you can see it as part of a wider struggle between interests such as environmentalism versus economics, public versus private, and even progress versus nostalgia.
We're interested in how the closed down train line can become a metaphor for linear or binary thinking while itself existing almost outside of time and space. We're using the train line in this film as a conduit for exploring popular visions of the so-called West as it's understood in the Irish context. Representations of the Irish West are often contradictorily associated with escape and freedom on the one hand, and with being trapped in a life of parochial rivalries and poverty on the other.
This, for a sense of like frontier zone opportunity tinged with hardship and danger, can also be seen echoed in depictions of the North American Wild West from the late 19th and early 20th century. And we also kind of perceive a longing felt in Ireland throughout history to go west, from the legendary voyages of St. Brendan in the 6th century to the thousands of Irish college students who come here every summer to work in like summer camps and Irish bars, which is a journey that we ourselves made in 2009.
Feels like a long time ago now.
So, I know that Niamh just said that we came here to make artwork, but I just wanted to get a job and make some money. So after sending out countless unsuccessful job applications, including one to a singing telegram company, who informed me that I would need to provide my own costumes, I eventually heard back from an ice cream company who were just starting out and, in their own words, wanted to become the Starbucks of the gelato world. Which is very exciting. They were starting their first concession, which happened to be in Madame Tussauds Wax Museum in Times Square. So I went in for my orientation and asked, could I work in the kitchen? Although I was completely unqualified to do so, the manager found out that I was Irish and immediately gave me a high five and instructed me to dance an Irish jig, which I did because I really wanted a job. Not that I even can, so they shouldn't have given it to me. But I went in for my into the kitchen and met the head chef, and he was an ex-software engineer. According to himself, he had won that game show, The Weakest Link. I didn't question it. He had a smashed knee because, he said, somebody had touched his dog and he didn't like that, so he attacked the man. he couldn't really walk, and he would sit in a wheelie chair in the middle of the tiny kitchen and direct operations by pointing at ingredients with his walking stick. Every time I made a mistake, which I frequently did because I shouldn't have been there, he would beckon me over and give me a little on the head. However, he would also take me out for steak dinners because he was worried that I was wasting away, which I probably was because they worked me 15-hour days and I didn't have time to eat anything except for strawberries and fancy Italian chocolate chips. The kitchen was tiny and was 100 degrees, which is an incredibly stressful temperature for making and storing ice cream at. And every morning I would arrive before dawn and stumble in the dark through the storeroom of Madame Tussauds, past old waxworks, buckets of wax and real-life rats to get into the kitchen to start preparing the vanilla bases for the day. One morning, when I was on my way down the stairs with a pan of ice cream, which is incredibly heavy and very cold and has these razor-sharp edges, I sliced my finger open and bled somehow directly into the sales counter, where the blood immediately froze over, as did the Windex that I sprayed on top of it to try and clean it off. And I think I probably scraped most of it out before anybody noticed, but I will never truly know whether or not I didn't get some into the special breakfast flavour gelato, particularly because frozen blood looks uncannily like frozen pomegranate.
I spent my time away in a much more hapless, half-hearted pursuit of a job, just wandering around Central Park and limiting my search to dog walking positions because I thought that animal welfare was my calling, and I also really wanted to see the interiors of wealthy Manhattan apartments. I just got so far as several awkward interviews. In one I was asked who I preferred out of Michael Collins and Eamon de Valera, who, if you don't know them, are historical revolutionary Irish figures, internationalised by the 1996 film starring Liam Neeson and Julia Roberts. I panicked and said, I prefer Eamon de Valera, and he's portrayed as the villain in the film, and also some would say through history. So the interviewer diligently wrote down Niamh, Dev in a small notebook, and needless to say I didn't get that job. Later that summer I took an unsuspecting date to the Irish Hunger Memorial in Battery Park, which is a maze of old stone walls, hawthorn bushes and a roofless famine era Irish cottage, which were all transported from the west of Ireland across the Atlantic to Battery Park. My date was unmoved by the famine era cottage at the centre of the monument, though I had to admit the cottage itself was uncharacteristically clean compared to ones that I'd seen and was used to seeing back home. I later learned that on deconstruction, the cottage had to be power washed stone by stone to safeguard Manhattan from the foot and mouth and BSE epidemics which ravaged the Irish countryside and Irish livestock in the early 2000s. I wasn't particularly moved myself by the cottage and all of the stories of displacement and the harshness of life that it could hold for people, but more so I was really excited by the simple, sublime technological feat of transporting such a ubiquitous little building, stone by stone, across the ocean and to be resurrected overlooking the New York City harbour. How proud the cottage must have felt, I thought, to have finally left it all behind. Needless to say, I never succeeded in finding gainful employment, so before the end of the summer I had to return home to Ireland. I finished out art college and I immediately sat the civil service exams, which is a common thing that happens at home. The exams entailed a very rigorous set of aptitude tests, a virtual reality office behavioural assessment, and a very thorough interview in which I lied fluently, asserting that I really find the fluctuating price of beef to be super interesting. I was assigned a role in the Department of Agriculture, right in the city centre, as soon as I arrived there, my new manager whisked me up to the 8th floor offices and proceeded to talk to me in a series of agriculture related acronyms, none of which I could find any meaning in. Besides, I was excited to see this panoramic view of the city outside the top floor canteen windows. I've never seen it from that angle before, and I really felt that I had arrived.
One day when the chef wasn't speaking to me for some reason, I managed to drop the plastic spatula all the way into the ice cream churning machine, where it shattered into 100 tiny pieces, and I spent the next hour crouched behind the counter, covertly pulling them out one by one, elbow deep in painful, freezing mango sorbet. My hands were perpetually covered in tiny cuts from grating fruit, so I would have to wear these latex gloves, and the gloves would slowly fill up with lemon juice and salt as I prepared the fig and tequila gelato flavour. Over the course of the summer, I slowly broke a toe because I had to run up and down stairs all day, every day, and insisted on wearing these giant shoes, not these giant shoes, but similar giant shoes, that I got in a thrift store and thought were cool. These and other incidents felt like a strange kind of torture, as did having to prepare vodka sorbet on hungover mornings, leaning over giant buckets of it, stirring and retching. I needed to get another job to supplement my income at the ice cream place. Back in Ireland, I played some church organ for the Church of Ireland, which I think here is like the Episcopalian Church. And I saw that a Baptist church in Brooklyn was looking for an organist, so I applied and got the job. When I went in for my audition, the pastor informed me that I'd better be wearing my Sunday best and that his congregation liked their singing militant. The playing itself was quite uncomfortable for me because they insisted that I take communion, which in their church consisted of a massive hunk of dry bagel, which would be left for me on the corner of the organ as I played, and I never figured out when I was supposed to have time to actually eat it. So, like, that. Week after week I got it wrong, and the congregation would give me dirty looks. It transpired that I was supposed to play both an organ and a piano, and so I hadn't brought my correct shoes. If there's any organists here, you know, it helps to have shoes to play the pedals with, so I wasn't using any shoes, and I would have to run back and forth between an organ and a piano, which happened to be located at the top of the church behind on either side of the altar, barefoot for 2 hours, which is how long the service was, behind the pastor as he was talking, and consequently got a lot more dirty looks from the congregation. So I gradually realised that they were never going to accept me, or my lack of shoes, and also it was going well in the ice cream place at that point, so I didn't actually need the money anymore, and I left. But the summer was coming to an end, as was my working visa, but the people who owned the ice cream place said they could help me out. They could get me a green card by just marrying me off to one of their sons. I know, right? One day, one of said sons approached me and said, I didn't realise you had to leave, and why not just finish art college here and just like marry me? He said all this while wearing a t-shirt with a light up digital clock on the front. So naturally, I said yes.
More weeks went by at the Department of Agriculture, which is referred to by established workers only as the department because it's the oldest dedicated government office on the island of Ireland, predating the Free State by about 3 years. It's just a bit of agriculture backstory for you. I continued to just have very little idea as to what I was supposed to be doing at my desk all day, so I tried to embrace civil servantry completely, which for me meant joining the union, joining the office lottery syndicate, and reading the department newsletter from top to bottom each week, which would advertise regular all-day conferences on tick prevention. It's handy. Every single Tuesday, this is true, it still happens. With a pious dedication, a very small group of vegan protesters gathers at the foot of the building and yells with a megaphone, "Blood, blood, blood on your hands," from exactly 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. every single week. It's very effective, even though it's a small group, in disrupting the work and leads to much blending of the statutory allowance of an 11 a.m. coffee break into long, lethargic lunches. I didn't like walking past them, and so every Tuesday I would have to take a very long route out of the office through a large car park, particularly if I was wearing leather shoes. One day my manager introduced me to a fellow entry-level worker who was employed at the sea of desks next to ours. She thought we'd get along because he was also an artist. He was a filmmaker with a David Lynchian hairdo who had found himself working at the much coveted food and drinks division, where he was receiving regular gifts from up-and-coming whisky distilleries. Every time I met him in the elevator, he would remind me that Flann O'Brien, who's an Irish satirist and, to be fair, noted alcoholic, was also a civil servant, and that Kafka had been a state insurance broker. I didn't really like hearing that, so I started to take the stairs, 7 flights, several times a day. As winter settled in, there was much discussion in the department about whether or not a snow day might occur. In Dublin, we can't really handle weather, so the previous year had been very snowy indeed, and it had led to several days off. No snow day arrived, however, a very impressive protest campaign was wielded by farmers against the declining price of beef, which, if you remember, was something I said I wasn't interested in. They very effectively and efficiently blockaded the city centre with their farm vehicles and equipment, impeding civil servants like myself from getting to our offices for days on end. Of course, the building itself already had security ramped up because a previous protest, this time by sheep farmers, had seen the whole building besieged by roaming livestock. In this episode of Department Folklore, a dozen or so hardy mountain sheep have been ushered and shepherded into the elevators and stairwells, all spilling out into the top floor offices, no doubt ready and able for the altitudes.
My marriage to the heir of the New York gelato empire was growing stale, unlike the ice cream, which was fresh and delicious. It turned out we actually had very little in common beyond our mutual appreciation for grapefruit and Campari sorbet, so I decided to take a trip north. The first time that I had left New York City, and indeed Madame Tussauds, for 10 years. I had always wanted to try sacred harp singing, which I'm sure some of you here would know is a form of community singing, hymn singing, which combines Old Testament fire and brimstone lyrics with folk melodies. And although the music itself is religious, the practice of it is vehemently secular and apolitical, and a nice example in this era of polarised debate of cross-community collaboration. So participants sit in a hollow square formation facing each other, and they sing in full-voiced 4-part harmony for hours on end, just breaking in the middle for a potluck lunch. So I travelled to rural Massachusetts to attend a Sacred Harp convention with a Dutchman who, on the first morning, woke me up by pinching my toe through the bedclothes so that we could go for a walk together at 5 a.m. The singing itself was incredible and very, very moving, and only nearly ruined when I managed to kick over an entire cup of coffee into the cream leather handbag of the woman in front of me, who was moments away from standing up to deliver the memorial lesson.
So more time passed and I was still at the department, and in a radical and totally unexpected turn of events, the hardcore vegan protesters actually joined forces with the disgruntled farmers, putting aside their obvious differences and completely opposing agendas to unite against their common enemy. One day, amid the chanting from below, the show of solidarity provoked in me a kind of emotional distress that I had never experienced before. And as I was staring at the spreadsheet on the screen in front of me, it seemed to explode into a kaleidoscope of columns and figures. Not wanting to cause alarm, in the very large open plan office that I worked in, I just closed my eyes and lay my head down on the desk and hoped that this sensation would pass, which thankfully it did. And when it did, I opened an email advertising Brexit emergency border control positions for anyone who was willing to leave their current job. I replied with my CV immediately, ready and willing to get out of the building and away from the turmoil. What followed was a series of seminars on importing and exporting animal products between what was now the UK outside of the European Union and Ireland inside the European Union, although none of the bells and whistles have changed. Also, we had a trip to the customs office and water safety training course for our work, which would be checking shipping containers. A team of state veterinarians came out of retirement for this one last "the country needs us" job. They had their own shared history, which included catching dairy product smugglers across the border with Northern Ireland back during the Troubles, and the drama of the BSE and foot and mouth epidemics that I mentioned earlier in the early 2000s. I found myself standing amongst them inside a storage container in the Dublin Docklands, all of us wearing hairnets and lab coats and clutching our takeaway coffees. We were staring into a refrigerator with the vets demonstrating to the administrators how to know when packaged beef has turned. The following day, I took 2 buses to the Midlands, to a hotel that had a pool, to undertake the water safety training course as a team building exercise. One by one, we each donned an inflatable life jacket and fell backwards, fully dressed, into the heated pool.
I left the Sacred Heart Convention feeling actually quite hopeful, and I realised that it was time to go. I had had enough of New York City, I'd had enough of making gelato every day, and I'd had enough of being startled by a surprisingly lifelike waxwork of Barbara Streisand that sat outside the kitchen. I literally thought they were bosses having a meeting one day, and they were just waxworks. I was losing my mind, I had to go. And I missed Ireland. I missed pubs, I missed just talking nonsense with strangers with like a shared implicit understanding that nothing is meant literally. And I even missed that weird awkward sensation of when a person grabs you by the elbow, looks you in the eye and sings you a very long, very sad ballad that you did not ask to hear. And I miss making art with Niamh. And I also realised that if I went back, I could claim back all my tax and have a soft landing in Ireland. So my now ex-husband didn't really care. Sure, he was only ever married to the ice cream.
So I also eventually left my job, as you can probably tell. I handed in my notice and hung up my lanyard, and I didn't really have to give very much notice because I spent a lot of extra time just skulking around the office, clocking up a thing that we have called flexi time, which gives you days off. My now estranged companion Ruth had returned to the country, and we decided to take a trip out west to explore some abandoned train lines and think a little bit more about our Irish Identities project. This is what we ended up making.